Hi, my name is Alice. I'm a social worker in Scotland. I work with children with disabilities and a lot of autism. Yeah, I think a lot of people, in fact, probably the majority of people don't really know what social workers do. And I think even social workers sometimes find it hard to describe what we do. Because the majority of people never come into contact with social workers. It's a specialist service. But I think the best way to sum it up is to sort of say social work is about support and protection. So it's about giving people the opportunities to achieve equity and equality. So it's about things like challenging poverty, challenging health inequalities, that kind of thing, gender inequality. By providing that could be like practical support. So it could be furniture for the house if the family does, like for example, the family don't have beds. It could be technology, for example, if you've got a child with autism who needs a tablet because they find that soothing and it helps their behaviour. And it's also about emotional support as well. So being a good listener is pretty much essential to be a social worker. And you get, in the type of social work that I'm in Scotland, you get very little time with people face to face. A lot of our work is assessment, paperwork based, and trying to progress those assessments. So you have to really make the time matter when you're with people face to face. So you need to be a good listener. And in terms of protection, obviously, everybody knows about child protection because that's what's always in the media. And that's why a lot of people have a negative connotation about social workers because that's normally what's focused on in the media. But of course, it is about protecting children. It's about protecting vulnerable people. So it could be an elderly person in a care home or at their own home, financial exploitation, working with the police. And as a social worker, you work with pretty much every other profession you can think of. You work with lawyers, you work with psychiatrists, you work with any type of doctor you can think of, nurses, occupational therapists, teachers, you name it, we work with them. So part of being a social worker is being able to get along with pretty much anybody and to maintain those relationships, even though very often, very frequently, you're going to have differences of opinion and you need to kind of work through that and be able to maintain that relationship even when you've gone through difficult times. So that's it. I would pretty much summarize it as support and protection. And also you absolutely must have good people skills. Right, so I started off in psychology and I mean, I've always been interested in people. I've always worked with people. So like from when I was 18, I volunteered at a mental health organisation. I worked for Shelter, which is a homelessness charity in the UK. I worked for elderly people as a carer. I did fundraising for Women's Aid in the NSPCC. So I've always had the urge to work with people and to help people. I've always had that sort of humanitarian streak. And I suppose that's something that was missing for me if I had gone into psychology, because in psychology, you don't really get to make that difference in terms of the structural parts of people's lives. So a psychologist can't say, go and buy somebody a bed to give them a bed and things like that. So anyway, one of my friends is a social worker. She'd been a social worker for a long time, 10 years. And I'd always said to her, I don't know how you do that. I couldn't do that job. And I don't know, I think it was just as I got older and I started to, because I think I lacked an understanding of what social workers do. So I didn't really understand the role. I just thought, oh, child protection, I don't want to do that. And then I met someone and we had a good chat about, in fact, I was working as a cleaner at the time on a building site, and I spoke to one of the men from, like, he was a scaffolding manager, and he was like, why are you working as a cleaner when you've got a degree in psychology? And I was like, because I don't know what to do. And he was like, have you thought about social work? Because my wife's a social worker, my son's a social worker, and my daughter's a social worker. And then he started telling me about all their different jobs. I think one worked with the elderly, one worked with children, and one worked with people with disabilities. And I had never thought of all these different ways that you could do social work. So once I kind of knew that, I just instantly applied and got in and loved it from day one. Right now, I work with children with disabilities, primarily autism, but also health conditions. So a lot of my job is assessment. So in Scotland, we've got something called self-directed support, and it's additional funding for children with disabilities or adults with additional needs. And so what I do is a big part of my job is assessing to see how much money that child needs to, for example, access special equipment or access specialist clubs and things like that. But part of my role is, so it's a specialist team, so it's like a sub team of children and families. So I will do all the normal child protection work, supporting families and things like that that a children and families team would normally do. But I specialise in doing it with children with disabilities. So for example, if you had a foster carer who was caring for a child with multiple health conditions and those health conditions were not being appropriately cared for, then that would be an issue where we would have a child protection issue with a child with a disability. So it's a very broad role. It involves so many different things. And I think that's why it's such a great job, because I do lots of finance stuff. I do all my assessment stuff, and I get, like I said, I get to work with pretty much every professional you can imagine. And in this role, you work with people over a long period of time, so years and years. So you really get to know the families that you're working with, ideally, and that helps with getting them to trust you. So this is a great job that I've got right now. Before that, I was in hospital discharge with elderly people, so it was over 65s. And that was a completely different job. It was hospital based and really, really challenging because of the timescales, wanting people discharged really quickly and trying to safeguard people's rights in that environment was really challenging, because when you're based in a hospital, you're in sort of health's territory. So you're the kind of the one that's out of place. So trying to assert yourself in that environment is quite difficult, and I find that quite challenging. But it also helps you develop courage, basically, which you need to have in social work. So I've had two jobs in social work, one with older adults in hospital and one with children with disabilities. They've both been great jobs. When I was working in the hospital discharge team, there was a woman that had came to our attention. She said she didn't want to go home because her partner was physically abusing her. Your family was completely and utterly traumatized, and she didn't want to go home. So what I did was we did an adult protection investigation, and I sort of stuck to her like glue for months to support her, because I think what she needed was a secure base. And I think that's if you understand attachment and what a secure base is, I think a lot of people need that in their lives to be able to make changes. And for this woman, I sort of became her secure base. I would visit her every week and we would talk through it. And she would talk about how, it's just easier if I just go home. It'll just be easier. And we would talk through how we'd got to that point. She left her husband and she got a house of her own. And she kind of gets to live out the rest of her life in safety and peace. And for me, that is so meaningful to have gone through that for such a long time. And I guess there would have been years and years where she thought this is just her life and she'll never get out of it. And then finally she did. So I'm really proud of that. And that's showed me how powerful social workers can be, because the police had tried to get involved before. And from the police's point of view, if somebody's not willing to give evidence, they're not interested anymore, because ultimately their job is to prosecute people. And I suppose that's where social work kind of fits in. It's when it's not criminal, but it's severely damaging. And that's where the support and protection comes in. It's definitely changed, because part of the normal social worker role is to be in people's homes. and that's where we get to know people and we understand their life better. But obviously, since March, the opportunities to do that have been so limited. And what's quite worrying for me is the amount of children that we haven't seen. And we're just kind of relying on, what the parents are telling us. We're just kind of having to rely on that being true, because some of the kids on my caseload haven't returned to school, and I can't go and visit their homes. So that kind of concerns me that we're missing that information right now. And I guess once society gets back to normal, then we'll find out what the true consequences of that have been for child protection. Because I did see like a statistic thing that came out in England said that child deaths were up by 20% this year, when over the past 10 years the number of child deaths had declined, and then this year it was up by 20%. And obviously that's not just social workers that aren't able to visit, it's also health visitors, paediatricians, all that kind of thing. So that's quite concerning. And it's been quite difficult to know that families are suffering and struggling and there's nothing you can do, because social work is all about problem solving, constantly problem solving. And social workers are always complaining about lack of resources because there's nowhere near enough. And in this job, I've really seen the impacts of austerity in the UK and how it affects people's lives and how people are just left with no support whatsoever. Even down to not having enough social workers on the team. I mean, my team's got 10 people on it, with four of us are social workers, and we cover half the city. So we are covering a population of 250,000 people. And any child that has a disability and needs a social worker will come to us. It's just ridiculous. But so the resources were already lacking anyway. And what happened during the pandemic was that all the resources shut down. All the kids that had respite booked, the parents who relied on that respite didn't have it anymore. And like I said, a lot of my caseload is autism, and a lot of children with autism need a lot of stimulation. And they're very, very set on their routines. And they rely on those routines. And when this pandemic hit, everything changed overnight, which is extremely difficult for kids with autism. And then knowing the parents were having to deal with that at home and they had no support, that was really difficult for me, because I felt like we're kind of storing up problems for later. Like right now, there's nothing that we can do, but when we're 6 months down the line, people are going to be not in a good way because they've struggled so much. So I think what's been difficult is obviously being away from my peers and my colleagues. Sometimes it doesn't really feel like you're part of a team because you're just in the house by yourself every day. And also kind of knowing what your families on your caseload are going through and not being able to do anything about it has been quite difficult. I mean, the finance stuff is tedious. That's really tedious because we have to do assessments and we have to, fill out forms, and it's just tedious. As a social worker, you love working with people. And so many social workers will say, I thought I was a social worker, not an accountant, because we so often have to deal with financial assessments or, some kind of assistance with finance. In my case, it's planning how budgets will be used. And I don't hate that part of my job. It's just tedious. It's boring. But it has to be done. Otherwise, the families can't access the money. So, like I say, I don't hate it. It's just not very interesting. What I love about my job is there's so many things that I love about my job. I could be at 3 meetings in one day and they're all completely different, with a completely different group of people. It could be like police and health in one meeting and then education in another. So I think for me, it's just a variety that you get, and you get to work with such a broad range of not only people, but professions as well. So you get to know all the other different professions so well, because social workers are always the link person that sort of brings everybody together. And as part of that, you have to build relationships with people. And to build relationships with people, you have to understand them and understand what their goals are and their objectives are. And that's the same whether it's a professional or whether it's a client. You need to get to know them. So I think it's the variety of the tasks and the variety of the people that I really love.